All right, this is Chapter 20, Section 3, The Atlantic Slave Trade. Students will explain the Atlantic slave trade through the life of enslaved Africans in the colonies. Now, the main idea is to meet their growing labor needs. Europeans enslaved millions of Africans in the Americas. Now, why does this matter now? Descendants of enslaved Africans represent a significant part of America's population today. Now, some terms and names we're going to go over are the Atlantic slave trade, the Middle Passage, and the Triangle Trade System. All right, and you can see here with this map, this is a map of the Atlantic slave trade. Europeans would come into Africa, to these different African nations, and capture people and bring them over. And this is where they would sell slaves, and they would move up to North America eventually. But most of them were going down to South America, into the Caribbean, and then they would make their way up into North America. The causes of African slavery: sugar plantations and tobacco farms required large supply of workers to make them profitable for their owners. European owners had planned to use Native Americans as a source of cheap labor, but millions of Native Americans died from brutal diseases, warfare, and treatment. Therefore, the Europeans in Brazil and the Caribbean and the southern colonies of North America soon turned towards Africa for workers, and this demand for cheap labor resulted in the brutalities of the slave trade. Now, beginning around 1500, European colonists in the Americas who needed cheap labor began using enslaved Africans on plantations and farms, and slavery had existed in Africa for centuries before this. Now, in most regions, it was a relatively minor institution. It wasn't that big, that's what that means. And the spread of Islam into Africa during the 7th century brought in an increase in slavery and the slave trade. So slavery is going to originate in Africa. Now, Muslim rulers in Africa justified enslavement with the Muslim belief that non-Muslim prisoners of war could be bought and sold as slaves. So if you were not a Muslim, if you were a Christian, or if you were Jewish, you can be bought and sold into slavery. And as a result, between 650 and 1600, Muslims transported about 17 million Africans to Muslim lands of North Africa and Southwest Asia. Now, in most African and Muslim societies, slaves had some legal rights and the opportunity for social mobility, so they could move around and talk. In the Muslim world, a few slaves occupied positions of influence and power. Some served as generals in the army. In African societies, slaves could escape their bondage in many ways, including marrying into the family they served. The demand for Africans. The first Europeans explored Africa were the Portuguese during the 1400s. The first Europeans to explore Africa were the Portuguese. Initially, the Portuguese traders were more interested in trading for gold than for captured Africans. Now, this is going to change with the colonization of Americas as natives began dying by the millions from diseases. Now, buying and selling of Africans for work in the Americas, known as the Atlantic slave trade, became a massive enterprise. And between 1500 and 1600, nearly 300,000 Africans were transported to the Americas. And during the next century, that number climbed to almost 1.3 million. And by the time the Atlantic slave trade ended, around 1870, Europeans had imported about 9.5 million Africans to the Americas. Now, Europeans saw advantages, in using Africans in the Americas. First, many Africans had been exposed to European diseases and had built up some immunity, so they weren't going to die from European diseases. Second, many Africans had experience in farming and could be taught plantation work. And third, Africans were less likely to escape because they did not know their way around the land like the Native Americans did. Fourth, their skin color made it very easily for them to be caught and tried, just because the fact that they just looked different from a European. Spain and Portugal lead the way. Now, the Spanish took an early lead in importing Africans into the Americas. Spain moved on from the Caribbean and began to colonize the American mainland, and as a result, the Spanish imported and enslaved thousands of more Africans. And by 1650, nearly 300,000 Africans labored throughout Spanish America on plantations and in gold and silver mines. And if you remember back in section 1, we talked about how the Spanish were enslaving Native Americans to go into those mines, those gold and silver mines, to mine for gold. But that wasn't working for them, so they turned to slave labor, specifically the Africans. All right, so by this time, however, the Portuguese surpassed the Spanish in the importation of Africans to the Americas, and during the 1600s, Brazil dominated the European sugar market, and as the colony's sugar industry grew, so too did its European colonists' demand for cheap labor. And during the 17th century, more than 40% of all Africans brought to the Americas went to Brazil. All right, slavery spreads throughout the Americas. And as other European nations established colonies in the Americas, England's demand for cheap labor grew. Thus, they also began to import large numbers of Africans. And the buying and selling of African slaves became known as the Atlantic slave trade. England dominates the slave trade. And as England's presence in the Americas grew, it came to dominate the Atlantic slave trade. And from 1690 until England abolished the slave trade in 1807, it was the leading carrier of enslaved Africans. And by the time the slave trade ended, the English had transported nearly 1.7 million Africans to their colonies in the West Indies. Now, African slaves were also brought to what is now known as the United States. In all, nearly 400,000 Africans were sold to Britain's North American colonies. And once in North America, however, the slave population steadily grew, and by 1830, roughly 2 million slaves lived in the United States. African cooperation and resistance. Many African rulers and merchants played a willing role in the Atlantic slave trade. Most European traders, rather than travel inland, waited in ports along the coasts of Africa. African merchants, with the help of local rulers, captured Africans to be enslaved. They then delivered them to the Europeans in exchange for gold, guns, and other goods. And as the slave trade grew, some African rulers voiced their opposition to the practice. Nonetheless, the slave trade steadily grew. Lured by its profits, many African rulers continued to participate. African merchants developed new trade routes to avoid rulers who refused to cooperate. Now, if you take a look at this map, you'll know what I'm talking about. Sugar and cotton and tobacco was being farmed in the Americas, and this would go to Europe. And the Europeans would then sell their textiles, rum, and manufactured goods to Africa, and then the Europeans would take the Africans enslave them, and sell them to America to do the work on the sugar, tobacco, and cotton in Europe. So you can see how this is a triangle trade. And after being captured, African men and women were shipped to the Americas as a profitable trade network. And along the way, millions of Africans died. Africans transported to the Americas were part of the transatlantic trading network known as the Triangle Trade. Over one trade route, Europeans transported manufactured goods to the west coast of Africa. There, traders exchanged these goods for captured Africans, and the Africans were then transported across the Atlantic and sold to the West Indies. Merchants bought sugar, coffee, tobacco in the West Indies and sailed to Europe with these products. Another triangular route, merchants carried rum and other goods from New England colonies to Africa. So there's that triangle trade system that I'm talking about. There they exchanged their merchandise for Africans. The traders transported the Africans to the West Indies and sold them for sugar and molasses. You can make rum out of molasses. They then sold these goods to rum producers in New England. Various other transatlantic routes existed. The triangle trade encompassed a network of trade routes crisscrossing the northern and southern colonies, the West Indies, England, Europe, and Africa. The network carried a variety of traded goods. Now, the Middle Passage, the voyage that brought captured Africans to the West Indies and later to North America and South America, was known as the Middle Passage. It was considered the middle leg of the transatlantic trade triangle. Sickening cruelty characterized this journey. And in African ports, European traders packed Africans into dark holds of large ships. And if you can see these figures to the left here, this is actually a ship and how they would pack this ship full of people. It's poor people getting shoved in here, chained down, and being shipped across the Atlantic Ocean, which would probably take 3 to 4 months. I don't know how they ate. I don't know how they went to the bathroom, but they probably just did it right there laying down. So you can see how a lot of these people died on the way over to America. On board, Africans endured whippings and beatings from merchants as well as diseases that swept through the vessel. Numerous Africans died from disease and physical abuse aboard slave ships. Many others committed suicide by drowning. Scholars estimated that roughly 20% of the Africans that boarded each slave ship perished during the trip. So 20% would be 1 in 5 people would die. And here's the Middle Passage, right here. And if you look at this map, you can see from 1451, slave trade was not very big. I mean, I'm sure it still was. And if you look at the map below that, from 1601 to 1700, it starts to pick up. And then from 1701 to 1810, you could really see it getting really bad. And then by 1811 to 1870, it slowed down because of the laws that America would put into place, but we'll get into that later, and also the American Civil War. Slavery in the Americas. Upon arriving in Americas, captured Africans usually were auctioned off to the highest bidder. After being sold, slaves worked in mines or fields. As domestic servants, slaves lived in a grueling existence, and many lived on little food in small, dreary huts. They worked long days and suffered beatings. In much of the Americas, slavery was a lifelong condition as well as a hereditary one. So that means if your parents were slaves, you're going to be a slave. That's what hereditary means. In this case, at least. And this is actually a real picture of a slave. And you can see from his back, the scars he has from all the whippings that he endured. Resistance and rebellion. To cope with the horrors of slavery, Africans developed a way of life based on their cultural heritage. They kept alive such things as their musical traditions, as well as the stories of their ancestors. So they were big on music and they were big on storytelling. Slaves also found ways to resist. They made themselves less productive by breaking tools, uprooting plants, and working very slowly. That's a good idea. Thousands also ran away. All right, so some slaves pushed their resistance to open revolt. And as early as 1522, about 20 slaves in Hispaniola attacked and killed several Spanish colonists. Larger revolts occurred throughout the Spanish settlements during the 16th century, and occasionally uprisings also occurred in Brazil, in the West Indies, and in North America. And in 1739, a group of slaves in South Carolina led an uprising known as the Stono Rebellion. And uprisings continued into the 1800s. Consequences of the slave trade. The Atlantic slave trade had a profound impact on both Africa and the Americas. In Africa, numerous cultures lost generations of their fittest members. They're young and able to European traders and plantation owners. In addition, countless African families were torn apart, and many of them were never reunited. The slave trade devastated African societies in another way by introducing guns to the continent. So they never had guns in Africa before the Europeans came. While they were unwilling to participate in the growth of the colonies, African slaves contributed greatly to the economic and cultural development of the Americas. The greatest contribution was their labor, and without their back-breaking work, colonies such as those on Haiti and Barbados may have never survived. And in addition to their muscle, enslaved Africans brought their expertise, especially in agriculture. They were very smart in farming. They also brought their culture, their art, their music, their religion, and food to continue to influence American societies till today. The influx of so many Africans to the Americas also left its mark on the very population itself. From the United States to Brazil, many of the nations of the Western Hemisphere today have substantial African American populations. Many Latin American countries have a sizable mixed race population as well. Africans were not the only cargo transported across the Atlantic during the colonization of the Americas. The settlement of the Americas brought many different items from Europe, Asia, and Africa to North and South America. It also introduced items into the Americas to the rest of the world. And that's your lesson for today. Thanks for listening. Peace out.